Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Preparing Educational Leaders for Leadership in Challenging Times, presented by Deakin University and The Educator. My name is Kylie Spear and I'm delighted to be your host today. Thank you all so much for joining us. Your presenters are from Deakin University, which ranks #1 in Australia and 5th in the world for education and education research, according to the US News Best Global Universities list. Deakin offers a personalised experience enhanced by world-class programs and innovative digital engagement. Deakin leads by creating opportunities to live and work in a connected, evolving world. Joining us today from Deakin are Dr. Katrina McDonald and Dr. Ben Arnold. Katrina is the Senior Lecturer, Educational Leadership and Learning at Deakin, as well as the Assistant Editor of the International Journal of Leadership in Education. Katrina's research and teaching interests are in educational leadership, social justice, and the sociology of education through a practice lens. Katrina has recently completed a doctoral study examining the social justice understandings and practices of principals working in some of the most disadvantaged locations in Australia. Katrina is a former anthropologist, archaeologist, and primary and secondary teacher. And Dr. Ben Arnold is the Senior Lecturer and Course Coordinator of the Master of Education Leadership and Learning at Deakin. Ben's research focuses on educator occupational health, safety and well-being, and he investigates a relationship between education policy and governments, workplace cultures, practices, and teachers' health and well-being in different contexts. Ben also considers how teacher wellbeing is defined and operationalised and the implications this has for teachers' work. Welcome to you, Katrina and Ben, and thank you both so much for joining us today. I'll now hand it over to you, Katrina, to begin today's webinar.
Thank you, and it's a delight to be here, and thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Firstly, Ben and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies and waterways from which we come together today. I join you today from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. Let's take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place and recognise with gratitude and respect the traditional custodians, both past and present of all the lands on which we work and live. There are many challenges and tensions to leading in educational organisations. Foremost in our minds, of course, is the catastrophic teacher workforce shortages that we're currently experiencing at the moment, but also, and this is related, the ongoing repercussions of the pandemic. But educational leaders face challenges at a range of scales that shape the way in which leaders practice, some of which they have little direct control over. Yet these challenges present tensions and dilemmas that leaders must navigate in order to lead in ethical, sustainable and socially just ways. At the larger scale, global and national, there are challenges that have a direct impact on education, but also challenges within education. Global issues impacting on education include global insecurity such as terrorism, war, humanitarian crises, all of which have an impact on global movement of people and have a local, can have a local impact. There's also inequality, which is growing in developed nations, global health. We're living in a post-truth world where fake news, skepticism about climate change, alternative facts and mis and disinformation have an impact on what happens on education. We have environmental catastrophes in Australia, the most recent of which have been floods and fires, for example. And there's also global challenges to the welfare state. Global and national issues impacting in education include such things as education as a colonial project. Indigenous communities in colonised nations, for example, argue that education serves to invalidate their knowledges and supports assimilation into the traditions and cultures of the coloniser. Global reform movements also have an impact. Think about the way that the OECD and testing like PISA influence the day-to-day lives in schools. There's also the ways in which national goals and the purposes of education are conceived. For example, there is a human capital argument for education, social and cultural reproduction, civic responsibilities, or alternatively, the German concept of Bildung, which is difficult to translate into English, but can be thought of as forming humanity and personal transformation, linking philosophy and education. Leaders also face challenges and tensions at the education system and educational organisational level. At this scale, challenges can include such things as, for example, political interference in ideologies, educational bureaucracies, local education markets, teacher supply, and the contextual details of communities. And as with large-scale challenges, educational leaders may have little direct control over some of these influences, but are able to make autonomous decisions about others. Some examples of these are education policy. For example, school autonomy reform policies, together with parental choice and accountability policies, have created an education market, which means that educational organisations and the leaders within them are in competition with each other for students. Another example is resourcing, and an example of this is rural and remote schools, for example. While they may attract additional equity funding, it doesn't necessarily cover the cost for things like getting allied professionals out to remote locations, or giving children and young people from remote areas experiences in the city. The other issues can be things like social and welfare policy, which prompts us to ask the question, how does a degraded social contract have an impact on leadership and leaders in educational organisations? Are schools, for example, being made responsible for solving a range of social problems? And then there's also the complexity of the role of leadership. Educational leaders manage an enormous range of challenges. Some of these are managing and monitoring curriculum development, assessment and reporting, staff selection and performance, professional development, financial management, developing school mission and values, driving school reform, community relations, community and social welfare, supervision of major building works, and who can forget having to deal with plumbing, the toilets every day, for example. Also grief counselling. And in addition to that leadership role in the school, it intersects with community challenges, including mental health and wellbeing, economic and social disadvantage, and access to products and services. So the increasingly complex work of educational leadership has led to work intensification. And this has a major impact on the recruiting and retention of educational leaders. So while we're facing a teacher workforce issues, there's also the problem of retention of educational leaders as well. The other educational leaders also face challenges and tensions at an individual level. These include their health and wellbeing, their personal dispositions, their intersectional identities, their emotions and their relationships. For example, the health and wellbeing of educational leaders, particularly principals, has been increasingly of concern in recent times. The intensification of the work and the complexity and workplace violence and managing human and economic resources all have an impact on the health and wellbeing of leaders. For some years, Phil Riley and colleagues have been carrying out national surveys to gauge the health and wellbeing of Australian principals. Their findings are a wake-up call to policymakers and educational bureaucracies. For example, a 2021 analysis indicates worsening long-term health indicators of burnout, sleeping troubles, stress and depressive symptoms. Principals are working an average of 54.5 hours a week, with a quarter of them doing more than 60 hours a week. And 80% of principals, alarmingly, have been subjected to offensive behaviour. Along with this, the work of educational leaders is emotionally intense, and the intense nature of their work has direct consequences for their health and wellbeing, their own personal relationships, and interactions with different stakeholders, such as educational authorities, policymakers, teaching and non-teaching staff, student families, and school communities. Within education, the broader context for leading we're increasingly seeing that the world seems to be volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The volatility captures the sudden and extreme and multi-layered fluctuations in economy, sociopolitics, geopolitics, and indicates difficulty of the identifying and describing the changes that we see in a pattern-like manner, which means that past experience and our knowledge of effective practices may no longer provide solid indicators for identifying solutions. Uncertainty captures the idea that it's becoming more difficult to anticipate change or events and predict how they'll unfold or what their potential impact may be. Complexity captures the idea that problems and their repercussions are multi-layered and harder to understand. So under conditions of high complexity, it's difficult to analyse and find solutions with accuracy. And ambiguity captures the idea that causal relationships are unclear and the precedents often do not exist for what we're trying to manage. We're in fast-paced, unclear and complex events are happening in our environments. So there's often more than one possible solution to a problem, but there may be no analytical process to follow to decide which option should be chosen. So we live in this volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world. What does this mean for leading? Research suggests that strategies that assist leaders to succeed in these uncertain and precarious times include such things as vision and purpose, fostering teams and partnerships, rapid information gathering and rapid response, improving both the speed and the quality of decision making, empowering staff, taking risks, trust, being innovative and creative approaches to problem solving, communication, engagement, commitment, consensus, collaboration, all with a strong ethical focus. Two key survival competencies in this VUCA world require leaders that are both trustworthy and collaborative by nature. Trust is one of the key competencies required by contemporary leaders because all other competencies are influenced by this. But building trust works both ways, from leaders to organisational members, and it requires mutual commitment and effort through competent performance, consistency, predictability, and empathy. So the role of the leader in collaborative environments is to communicate a vision and provide guidance so that people interact in ways that can leverage individual strengths to create collaborative outcomes. And key to this is the reflexive view of your own moral and ethical understandings of the purpose of education. Oops. Despite the many challenges and tensions outlined here in the complex, uncertain times that we're living through, educational leaders with a focus on social justice will have a strong ethical and moral understanding of their work and be willing to challenge structural inequalities through a range of practices. And these practices include having a strong focus on pedagogy, where leadership in a school will be focused on improving student learning outcomes, but also on learning with the staff. They'll promote a shared ethos of social justice as a key part of the school's agenda, though leaders will ask of themselves and their staff and community, what are the purposes of education and how do we in our school work towards or against those aims? They will be critically reflective, reflecting in, on and for action, but also critically reflexive, scrutinising how their own experiences may create unexamined biases and prejudices. They will promote leadership dispersal. They'll be committed to spreading leadership practices, sharing responsibility and power across the school, support collaborative decision-making, and also champion the development of leadership in others. They will implement structures and strategies that support the smooth running of the school and seek to develop networks with the local community that creates powerful educational connections. They will champion supportive social relationships with and between staff, students, and in the community. We know that learning takes place within and through relationships, and also effective educational leadership occurs within and through relationships. This characteristic also includes supporting the development of a culture of care, which encourages teacher professional risk-taking and leads to high trust, low surveillance environments where teachers have the support to do their job. They will promote inclusion, giving voice to teachers, parents and students, particularly to the marginalised in the community. Critically, they will be activist and political. They will understand that forms of marginalisation, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., and they will explore how structures and processes constitute systemic cultures and seek to openly acknowledge and challenge these. They will challenge power relations and structural inequalities and deficit discourses. And they will be able to think critically about leadership discourse and what has been sold, and explore and understand writings on social justice, inequality, diversity, politics, sociology, and philosophy, for example. Now, this seems to be a lot to ask of any individual, but this is where the importance of continuing to explore and develop your own ethical and moral understandings of your work with children, young people, and adults in educational organisations. It's a key strategy to deal with the uncertainties of our times, to manage the dilemmas, the challenges and tensions that we are faced with on a daily basis. Handing over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Katrina, and good morning, everyone. So I'd like to pick up from where Katrina left off. Katrina's highlighted some of the key issues at the global, national, and organizational levels, and some of the challenges that this presents to leaders in education. So I'll draw on some observations from Early and Greeny, who argue that educational leadership paradox is actually a set of contradictions that sit at the heart of policy in many education systems. And this presents a series of challenges to educational leaders. So policymakers in these systems want things that, if not inherently at odds, are at least in tension with one another. For example, there's a push for freedom and autonomy for leaders, but at the same time, policymakers have increased control over organizational performance and practices. There are tightly defined standards for students, courses, and curriculums that pressure leaders to focus on particular outcomes. And at the same time, leaders are expected to prepare students to cope with uncertain futures. Leaders are expected to increase the choices available to students and parents, whilst promoting inclusive educational cultures and ensuring that all students achieve the same outcomes. Leaders must close the gap for the most disadvantaged students, whilst ensuring that high-performing students are stretched. And leaders should ensure that their organizations collaborate to share knowledge and expertise, whilst competing with other organizations for funding, resources, and students. So, of course, there are variations between different educational contexts and between the different levels of education, but I think the paradox applies across settings, and this makes leadership work in education, as Katrina's alluded to, very challenging and complex. So another way of representing the tensions and challenges that face education leaders is a bit like this. So education leadership is traditionally framed like this: hierarchical, top-down, simple, and straightforward. But especially now, in volatile and uncertain times, it looks more like this: messy, complex, context-specific work that's shaped by multiple interdependencies and interactions that can't neatly be mapped out or planned for. As Katrina explained, there isn't a manual or a set of procedures that leaders can turn to lead their organizations. So before I move on to talk about how professional learning can support leaders to deal with the challenges of the roles, I think it's really important to emphasize that many of the challenges that leaders face in education are exacerbated by systems and policies that create unequal learning opportunities and that regulate and direct leaders' work in particular ways. So as well as preparing leaders for these challenges, we need to work to address systemic issues and ensure that policies support the development of fairer, more equitable systems, respect education professionals, and enable rather than constrain leaders in their work. All right, so in the current state of affairs and the need for leaders to work in complex and challenging environments, the quest is to support leaders to recognize and mitigate the challenges that they face. And I'll focus on how professional learning for leaders might help to do this. So there are 5 key areas that we argue educational leaders need to address if they're to lead in these challenging times. They need to meet the needs of diverse learners and navigate complex ethical dilemmas, create healthy, supportive educational environments, lead sustainable change in educational organizations, identify problems, assess strategies, and critically reflect on action in their organizations, create opportunities for professional learning and growth. So over the next few slides, I'll discuss each of these issues in more detail. But before we get to that, our key argument is that these priorities require leaders to have certain knowledge, skills, values, attitudes, and behaviors that are determined by their professional identities. And we're saying that the foundation for leaders' professional identities, especially in 2023, is a critical, intellectual, and ethical orientation to leadership. So one of the fundamental aspects of leadership preparation is to enable leaders to meet the needs of diverse learners and navigate complex ethical dilemmas. We know that inequalities in the education system are a critical issue, and that many Indigenous and minority students are marginalized and excluded by the education system. So although these challenges clearly require broader social and political change, within education settings, the values, actions, and behaviors of leaders make a difference. So this framework illustrates that leaders can draw on different ethical theories to establish their own ethical orientation that guides their action and decisions. So we truly believe that understanding different ethical approaches is critical for contemporary leaders to address ethical dilemmas and address the needs of diverse learning communities. So one school of ethical thought is that leaders can draw on the ethic of justice. And the focus here is on an ethics that makes decisions based on universal principles and rules. So leaders can ask questions like, what rights are there for this issue? For whom? Are there any rules or policies that can guide us in making our decision? The next ethical approach that can inform ethical frameworks is the ethic of care. And this lens really emphasizes the importance of caring for and nurturing the local community. The ethic of critique aims to give voice to the suppressed and challenge societal structures and arrangements. So when making decisions or facing ethical dilemmas, leaders can reflect on who has the power, who are the silenced voices, and how might we make more fairer, more equitable arrangements. Finally, the ethic of the profession refers to the rules that guide how a leader as a professional should act towards others. For many educators, the main imperative is to ask, how can we support the learning, development, and well-being of students in our communities? So this framework demonstrates that by engaging with key ethical theories and using them critically to reflect on dilemmas in their settings, leaders can develop their own ethical orientation to guide their actions and solve, or at least address, complex ethical dilemmas. The next area is enabling leaders to create healthy, supportive educational environments. So over recent years, there have been growing concerns about the health and well-being of students, and particularly over the last year, as Katrina mentioned, we've heard that the education workforce is in crisis and that many educators are stressed and considering leaving the profession. So it's really key that leaders act with integrity to promote the health, well-being, and sustainability of learning communities. One way of thinking about this is to create psychologically safe environments, and a term that's often used is the psychosocial safety in climate. And that refers to the shared belief by members of the organization that their psychological health and safety is protected and supported by senior leaders. So leaders can create a psychologically safe environment through leadership commitment and demonstrating a commitment to stress prevention, leadership priority by making the health and safety of educators, students, and other members of the community a priority over and above performance goals. Organizational communication. So there are safe and easy to use channels for educators and students to share their concerns and seek support. And organizational participation, where individuals at all levels of the organization are involved in discussions about how to promote the health of the community. A key feature of psychosocial safety is also cultural safety, and it's critical that education environments are safe, especially for Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people, and also students and educators from other minority groups. Another key area for leadership development is to ensure that leaders look after themselves. As Katrina mentioned, there's a lot of evidence that leaders face very challenging working conditions and negative mental health outcomes as a result of their work. So this chart from our research shows that between 2011 and 2020, Australian school leaders on average 33% experienced low symptoms of burnout, 39% experienced moderate symptoms of burnout, but almost 25% experienced high symptoms of burnout, and 4% reported being severely burnt out. So it's really important that leaders are also aware of their own limits and plan and organize their work in ways that makes the role safe and sustainable. And of course, they need support from their superiors and their leaders to be able to do this. We also argue that leaders need to be able to lead sustainable change in their organization. In education, there's always a temptation to do more, to introduce the latest new programs, to solve new problems. However, more recently, arguments have been made for de-implementation, recognizing that more isn't always better, and the need to remove programs that aren't working. It's also important to consider whether the programs that are often presented as best practice are actually suitable for our setting. There are many examples of programs being brought in from overseas or from elsewhere that don't meet the needs of the local context. So leaders need to recognize that sustaining change is incredibly difficult because educational organizations are very complex and they don't operate in predictable ways. This means that what we expect to happen is unlikely to happen in practice. So to begin to deal with this complexity, leaders must learn to move from prioritizing external expertise to viewing improvement as a local developmental process, from driving change through leadership and management to leading change through collaboration and engagement with the community, from standardized, rigorous programs to those that address local conditions and are supported by evidence from the local setting, from a compliance-based approach to change where educators are expected to follow the rules, to supportive policies and practices that enable educators to exert their professional expertise and address the needs of their students, from a culture of implementation where educators put existing schemes into practice, to a culture of learning and innovation where educators are supported to develop strategies that meet the needs of their students. And from resources for initial project development and implementation to long-term funding and resources for programs. And connected to the issue of sustainable change is enabling leaders to identify and assess strategies and critically reflect on action in their organization. We've shown that in many settings, policies, programs, and practices are not meeting the needs of students. And there are popular concerns about education and the way that education often isn't about the local needs of students. Instead, external expectation of what a good education is, such as exam success or learning the basics, can lead to a narrowing of educator practices and student learning. So to understand what students need, it's important that leaders focus on developing their understanding of their local setting through critical reflection and evaluation. And to do this, we argue that leaders need to learn to move from simply understanding their organizations through external standards, which we call self-inspection, to a richer, more nuanced understanding, which is often referred to as self-evaluation. And this means going from top-down approaches that rely on externally produced information to understanding the organization through bottom-up approaches that engage with local perspectives. From seeing evaluation and reflection as a one-off event to viewing it as continuous and ongoing. From a snapshot of the organization to an evolving picture. From a focus on generating evidence for those outside of the organization to a focus on developing evidence for local improvement. And from a rigid, inflexible approach to evaluation to a more flexible and spontaneous approach. And finally, from avoiding risks to being able and permitted to take risks. So this approach is necessary to enable leaders to help organizations to learn, to understand themselves on their own terms, and to be driven by internal local needs rather than external priorities. The final area for leadership preparation is creating opportunities for professional learning and growth. Educators are often blamed for the limitations of the education system. There's often a focus on going back to basics to improve education. And this has implications for educators as they're often given directives and instructions on what they should be teaching and how they should be teaching. And perhaps professional learning historically hasn't necessarily helped to support a rich idea of educator professionalism because it often relies on the one-off workshop model. It focuses on training teachers in new techniques and behaviors. It's not related to the specific context that educators work in. And it expects educators to make changes in isolation and without support. So for leaders to support the development of professional learning, it's important that professional learning is relevant to educators' intellectual, emotional, and practical needs, that it's organized and led by individuals and groups who understand and care about adult learning and how it's best organized, that it's aligned with organizational needs and practices, that it's timely and relevant, that it's accessible and in forms that are convenient, and then it really enhances educators' overall sense of well-being and agency. So one approach to structuring professional learning that can enable educators to be inquirers and critically reflect on their practice is action research and also things like professional learning communities where educators can work together and engage in rich discussion. But all of these things require time and resourcing within the organization. So to conclude and draw our argument together, we're really saying that both professional learning and system reform is required and that it needs to focus on enabling leaders to focus on teaching, learning, and well-being within their communities, addressing the needs of students and promoting an ethos of social justice, ensuring that educators are able to critically reflect on their practice and systematically engage in reflection and evaluation, that there's a sense of shared leadership and collaboration within the community, that there's a real focus on local needs and priorities and somewhat a resistance of external demands and expectations, and that there's an emphasis on the health, safety, and well-being of the community and the extent that existing policies, programs, and practices support or inhibit that. So thanks very much for joining us today. We're going to turn shortly to some questions and answers, but before we do so, if you're interested in any of our courses at Deakin, please jump online at this link and feel free to contact Katrina and I with any questions that you have about our presentation or about any of the courses that we run at Deakin. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ben and Dr. Katrina, for those fabulous and thought-provoking presentations. As Ben has mentioned, it is now time to begin the Q&A section of the webinar. So to our attendees today, please do keep submitting any questions or comments you may have via the Q&A or chat function. Our first question for you, Katrina and Ben, is how can you best motivate colleagues to embark on using updated educational pedagogy?
You want to go, Ben?
Sure. Well, I think it's about how professional learning. So I think we reflected a bit on the kind of episodic, individual, kind of fragmented approach to professional learning. So I think it's about really developing systems and models of professional learning within organizations that enable educators to critically reflect on the meaning of the profession and the meaning of their work, and then connect the learning and the innovation to their values and their ethos as a professional. So I think grounding professional learning in a bigger purpose is the first stage, and then thinking about the types of processes that enable that type of critical reflection. So we talked about action research, we've talked about continuous improvement and reflection and evaluative thinking. So those sorts of philosophical approaches to professional learning. Did you want to add to that, Katrina?
Yeah, I was just going to say that change in educational organisations is hard and can be very slow, much slower than you would imagine. And I'm talking years to bed down change. So if you want to motivate colleagues, then one of the things that's absolutely imperative is that it's a bottom-up approach in identifying a problem of practice in your context. And so once you identify a problem of practice, then you can work together in professional learning teams or doing action research to address those sorts of change. Change is very hard if it's just a top-down approach. You're not going to get people buy-in easily. So the motivation, I think, and it's a good question about motivating. I think it has to start from a problem of practice in that context, in a sense. So, but that's as a whole staff as well. So.
Yeah, and I think aligned with that is having time and space to be able to process those issues collaboratively, and being given the time and the space to be able to do that. Often we have professional learning experience that are fragmented, that they're infrequent. So thinking about how we can structure professional learning opportunities that enable ongoing reflection and ongoing engagement with a key issue, and not having too many priorities to try and address in one go, I think is another key element of that.
That's great advice. Thank you both so much. And thank you to whoever submitted that fabulous question. Question number 2, how can we enable principals to spend time on rethinking the way they work, given all the expectations placed on them, and how the system, corporate office, can receive and share best practice and positive learnings?
I'll start with that. This is a good question and a difficult question to answer, because this is not just down to the principal. This is a systemic education bureaucracy issue as well. We talked about the intensification of principals' work and the complexity of their work. So there has to be system level responses to that, as well as kind of individual personal reflection and response. And that's why we talk about reflexivity is important here, and reflective practice as well. Ben, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think alongside school principals in early childhood centres and in higher education settings, there's often a kind of managerial view of the leadership role that presents the kinds of tensions and dilemmas that we've discussed today. So certainly there needs to be a review of what we actually think the purpose of educational leadership is at a broader system and policy level. But within the setting, I think we've really talked through the key areas that we think leaders really should come to terms with to help them to prioritize. I think there's so many things to be done in educational organizations, and they're so complex that the list never ends. So part of it is about saying, what are the real needs and priorities of the community, and how are we going to work as a group to address those needs. And I think we've talked through some of the strategies to do that today.
Yeah, and I would just add there, what's one of the really important things there is having a shared understanding of the purpose of education in your organisation and your context. We talked about, you know, there actually isn't a shared understanding of the purpose of education because they have different purposes. So a national goal will be different and often harks to a kind of human capital argument. I think educators and leaders really need to go back to thinking about, for them, what is the purpose of working in the educational, what do they see is the purpose of education in the contexts and settings that they work in.
And I think, sometimes often this dilemma between what leaders value and what they believe in and what they're expected to do is the cause of great distress and tension in leader, probably the biggest cause of stress and tension and burnout in leaders' lives. So we're not saying there's an easy solution to that problem. We always need to speak back to systems and policies that create more mess and administration for leaders. But at the same time, I do think it's about, grounding and having a clear sense of purpose and thinking about what is just purely administrative work and what is the fundamental work of a leader, what's really actually the priority and what's really going to make a difference.
Amazing, thank you both. The next question, what if the needs of local communities and designing organisations that meet those needs are divergent and markedly different from each other and within that community?
I think, again, our previous answer addresses this as well. I mean, this is probably is fairly common, and as Ben says, it's the one of the biggest tensions that educational leaders have to face. What does my community need? What do the children and the families in my community need versus what the education bureaucracy is expecting me to do? And it's at this point that I think which is why we talk about developing an ethical understanding, a moral understanding of your work, because it's at this point that leaders may have to make decisions about what to prioritise. And I know in my research in highly disadvantaged in schools in highly disadvantaged locations, I have interviewed principals who will say, no, who make decisions about what not to take on in their communities. And that could be a risk. That's a risk to career and a risk to their relationship with the bureaucracy, possibly. So, it does come, in cases like that, it comes back to your own moral and ethical understanding of what you are doing in your role.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there's no easy answer to that question, because you may have certain community standards that don't align with your values and your ethics, or with the national rights and national agreements on what's acceptable. So you can have particular community groups that, for whatever reason, don't believe that certain groups should have the same rights, or that certain things should be taught in education organizations. And so addressing those kind of dilemmas is really difficult, and it's inevitable that you are going to have different views within the community. I think, sometimes there'll be national guidelines and frameworks, or state level guidelines and frameworks that can help you to draw a line as to what the legality of the situation is, but there'll always be the need for this ethical framework and an ethical process of reflecting on how you're going to manage these kinds of challenges. And there's no one answer, there's no template, there's no process. It's about responding to the needs of the community and having some really good resources to enable you to do that.
And sorry, I was just going to say, add to that, every school is different, every community is different, and so the ethical model that Ben presented, which includes thinking ethically from different perspectives. So the ethics of, sorry about my dog, the ethics of justice, the ethics of care, and the ethics of critique, along with the ethics of the profession. These frameworks actually provide a really strong lens through which to view the dilemma. And in order to work through dilemmas like that, it helps to have a network of people with whom you can discuss these kinds of ethical issues. That promotes ethical and moral growth in individuals, but also it's a support. So
you may be sensing a little bit of a theme in the questions that our audience has submitted, because the next one is, what if ethical and intellectual frameworks diverge within a community?
Well, they will. They do. They will between us three sat here. So, you know, there's always going to be differences in how people view problems. And I think not seeing that, sometimes that can create really, really huge difficulties. But often it's more a matter of discussion and debate and acknowledging different views and explaining and giving a clear rationale for why a particular approach has been adopted. And as Katrina mentioned, the kinds of frameworks that we've proposed can help you to really think through these problems deeply and to give a clear articulation of why, and that's a solution. But sometimes there are just sort of intractable differences where some groups feel that the way that they would like education to be organized isn't respected or reflected. And I think we always have a duty to listen and to reflect on what we're doing, and then to look to through the ethics of justice, look to national rules and guidelines and regulations, through the ethics of care, think about, are we caring for the community, and through the other ethical theories and perspectives to sort of reflect on what we're doing and what the best or the least worse solution is for the problem that we're facing.
These are wicked problems, and a day-to-day feature of the work of educational leaders. And we wish there was an easy answer, but there's not.
Next question. How can we best balance well-being of staff with role expectation and professional commitment when some staff take advantage of leadership generosity?
I think that's a really good question. I think the first point is to think about what are the issues related to, when we're talking about well-being, what are we talking about? And I think we're generally in the education workforce talking about challenging working conditions, the status and respect that the profession has, and the kinds of problems that presents on an individual level in terms of levels of satisfaction with work and sort of levels of stress and burnout. So when we think of it like that, as a leader, what's within our control, the status of the profession, not so much. That's, probably more of a broader systems and policy issue, but certainly we can respect educator professionalism within our organizations. And we can think about whether the environments that we create actually listen to the needs of educators and other members of the community in terms of what they need for their psychological health. And then I think there's an expectation as well on the other side that educators come to work and act as professionals, and that they have a set of professional ethics that guide their actions. So I don't think the two are sort of mutually exclusive. And I think we need to create safe and supportive environments. And if individuals, are thought to be taking advantage of that, then there's the discussion around the kind of professional ethics to have there. What are your thoughts on that, Katrina?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I wonder in this question about shared understandings. I think we make assumptions as educators that we all share understandings about our roles and our professionalism. But I wonder if in this case that led to this question, whether there is perhaps a difference in understanding of what role expectation is, or what is expected in terms of professional commitment. And I think so that's an important point for educational leaders to take on board, is around communication and shared understandings of expectations, and making sure that everyone's on the same page.
Great point. Next question. How can we best manage culturally diverse staff makeups?
I'll start with this one. I think this goes back to the discussion we've been having around reflexivity and understanding and examining our own life experiences and what unexamined prejudices and biases that we might have. I think culturally competent leadership is really important here, and that goes to self-knowledge, and that's the reflexivity and awareness about our own culture and our own understandings of what is so understanding where we're coming from and how we view others. I think that's our own culture and awareness of that, and that's also including that is awareness of our worldview. It's also about experience and knowledge of different cultural practices, and that is on us to learn. It's not for other people to teach us, and it's about being aware of our own attitude to cultural differences. So all of these are encompassed in that idea around reflexivity and examining who we are and how we see others.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And if you look at the Australian education system and the workforce within the Australian education system, it isn't reflective of Australia's multiculturalism. So there's a challenge there around what a more multicultural education system looks like, in terms of not only the student body, which is diverse, but in terms of the education workforce and how that could be more inclusive and more diverse and respect different views and perspectives and enable different members of different groups to access the education system and work within the education system.
And we might make this our last question. Is upskilling the profession the best way to foster staff well-being?
I'll start with this one. No, the best way to foster staff well-being is to create a workforce and an education system that is healthy and sustainable and that respects education professionals' judgments and expertise. And I don't think we're there at the moment. So if there is an education system that respects educators' views and organizes their work and organizes the things that they have to do in a way that enables them to be safe and healthy, that's the priority. And I think that we're a long way from doing that, but there at least is a political will to take on board some of these views, but we've got a long way to go. Professional learning can help. Definitely professional learning can help you to feel more confident in your role and can help you to do some aspects of your role more safely and minimizing the harm or promoting your health. So professional learning can help, but it isn't the priority. It's a part of a complex puzzle, really, that we need lots of different things to change in order for some educators do find their work very healthy already, but for many, it's a challenging role. And so for those that find it very challenging and stressful, we need to think about not just giving them more, putting more pressure on them to learn and to change, but also thinking about how we can support them and what the kinds of pressures are that they face and how we might redesign roles to make them safer and healthier.
And I would just add, as you know, upskilling is not a panacea, as Ben has just said, but if you're endlessly upskilling and adding layers of things on top, some other things have to be taken away. And I think that's the way many educators experience this kind of professional development. Something gets added, but nothing gets taken away.
And I suppose just another thing is it depends on the kind of professional learning that we're talking about. If we're just talking about compliance-based, do this, do that, then that's not really going to make much of a difference. If we have something that enables educators to have agency, to feel that they can grow their professional expertise and that they have opportunities to share their expertise. I think that's a different type of professional learning. The question is, how do we enable a stronger profession that is healthy, rather than how do we make individual educators healthy? So how do we transform the profession and the view of the profession among public and policymakers so that it's viewed as a respectable, worthy profession? And that will, of course, have effects for the health of the workforce, rather than looking at how do we change individuals within the workforce to try and make them feel better.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Katrina and Dr. Ben, for those great answers, and once again for such fabulous presentations today. To our audience, thank you for joining us and for your invaluable participation today. Clearly would not have been the success that it was without it. Also, just a reminder that the entire webinar and presentation decks will be emailed to you all. And in the meantime, on behalf of the Educator and Deakin University, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.